Hi. I'd like to start the show off today with a song. Knew you. Val has got in contact with a mountain man named John. John, are you there?
He's not here yet. Oh, there, maybe. Just a minute. Hi, John. Are you on?
Yeah, I am.
Hi, John. Good of you to join us.
No problem.
This is Tim from Oregon. He's the host of the show. He's from Grants Pass, Oregon. I'm Val, or Landslide is my trail name. I'm from Huntington Beach. And we have Claudia from Corpus Christi, Texas right now. So good of you to join us. Thank you.
No problem. So
Yeah,
Tim,
hi.
Val, and sorry, who was the Claudie? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just give brief.
Is my line okay? Because it's the kind of the only line I have. So
Yeah,
we can hear you good. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll give. This is on your website, on the San Jacinto Trail Report website. I'll just give a brief intro about who you are, John. It says here, John, you're the most active hiker and mountaineer in the San Jacintos, hiking or running local trails 6 or 7 days a week, averaging over 3,000 miles and 700,000 feet of elevation gain annually. You hold several arcane records for ascents of San Jacinto Peak, and you volunteer locally with the U.S. Forest Service, Mount Jacinto State Park, and the Pacific Crest Trail Association. John has hiked and camped worldwide for about 40 years, and in the San Jacintos for more than 20 years. He has been involved with multiple local search and rescue teams, is a certified wilderness first responder, has level 1 Avalanche and Avalanche Rescue certifications, and is a fire lookout at both Tahquitz Peak and Black Mountain. And John, I found you by following the Second Chance Hiker this year in the PCT, and he had that episode with you showing people how to self-arrest with an ice axe. So that's how I found you. So again, welcome to the show. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you're the mountain man up there. You are the man, looks like. Maybe you could give us first like a history of the mountain. I'm just kind of curious about, do you know anything about the Indians that lived there, or the first people that were around there, pioneers, or any legends about it? Some of the history.
Oh man, that's a long story right there. But so the San Jacinto Range is kind of unique in that it's two reasons. Firstly, it's unusually prominent because pretty much all the terrain around it is basically sea level. So everything to the west and east is basically sea level. In fact, to the east is even below sea level, kind of around the Salton Sea. And that's kind of an artifact of California's geography, because unlike all of the ranges to the north, it's the San Jacinto and Santa Rosa ranges are part of the sort of the peninsula ranges. So they're actually part of the Baja California ranges. And they're so prominent because as the plates shifted, that moved north and kind of ran into California. Obviously, the divide is the San Andreas Fault, which is immediately north of the San Jacinto Range. So it kind of got thrust up and is just unusually prominent. So it pretty much goes from sea level up to nearly 11,000 feet. So that's kind of unique. And to the immediate, so San Gorgonio, which is the highest peak in Southern California, which is exactly 20 miles due north from San Jacinto Peak, actually slightly northwest, is part of the Transverse Range. which itself is sort of connected to the Coast Range. It's kind of part of the whole bigger picture of mountain ranges in California. So the San Jacintos are kind of unique in that regard. They're sort of their own thing. The North Face is particularly famous because it's got to get this right, but largely the largest vertical ascent outside in the lower 48 states. So it's kind of historically been used for training for things even like Himalayan ascents, because you in the North Face you can have a section that's in a good year. Of course, we don't get many good years these days, but can have something as much as 6, 7, even 8,000 feet of vertical ascent of snow. In terms of the Native American population, that was the Cahuilla, which is Cahuilla. That's actually that group had a pretty small distribution, kind of immediately around the San Jacintos. They wintered primarily in Palm Springs, what is now Palm Springs. Obviously, that was their water source in the winter, and then moved up into the high country in the summer. They're now represented by several groups that are kind of scattered around the fringes. None of them are really in the high country anymore. There's the Morongo group that's in the pass, the San Gorgonio Pass between San Jacinto and San Gorgonio. The Cahuilla Reservation is to the west. The San Jacinto Reservation's also to the west, slightly north of that. And who am I forgetting? The Agua Caliente group, who are based in Palm Springs, and kind of have the famous reservation that has a lot of hiking in Palm Canyon, which is sort of on the eastern slopes of the San Jacintos. And then I guess the most famous aspect of the pioneer history is several areas around here are named after Anza, who was one of the early Mexican explorers, whose famous kind of route that ultimately went all the way up to the Bay Area. One of the initial routes of discovery came right through this area. One of the small towns, which is kind of on the southwest fringe of the San Jacinto Mountains, is actually named after him, Anza. Obviously, the Anza-Borrego Desert. So there's a really unusually rich history of both Native American and then early pioneers. And then where I am here in Idyllwild, which is at 5,500 feet, was first colonized by European Americans in about the 1870s, 1880s, initially for kind of lumber and then cattle grazing. And Idyllwild itself was effectively founded in the very early 1900s. I mean, there were European Americans in the area from the late 1800s, but the town's history is kind of just over 100 years. Was that kind of that's like an incredibly broad brush over a ton of detailed history.
No, that's a great overview. And I have a lot of questions, but I'll get Tim and Claudia chime in too if they have anything to share, any questions. Go ahead, you guys.
Well, have you seen any changes in the air and the water and the vegetation?
Yeah, no, that's been dramatic. I mean, and that's so to give a little backstory on that. My personal history and training is as a environmental biologist, and specifically as an endangered species wildlife biologist. So I guess I would say I sort of have my finger on that pulse probably an awful lot more than most people. My history with the San Jacintos is shorter than some people's, but I've seen dramatic changes even in that in that time. So I first hiked San Jacinto Peak about 23 years ago. But my mum-in-law and her family have lived in the area since just after the Second World War. So that's why I started visiting the area back in the 1990s. And to put it in a kind of a really simplified synopsis, when I first visited in the 90s, it was fairly typical for San Jacinto Peak here on the south side of the pass and San Gorgonio on the north side of the pass, two peaks, both, up above 10,500 feet. They would stay snow-capped fairly well into the summer. I have pretty vivid memories, particularly from the 1990s. It was probably after the 97, 98 El Nino, of snow remaining in the high country, certainly into about July, probably on San Gorgonio, which is 700 feet higher. There was probably even tiny little snow cap even into August. Something like that has not happened now for probably close to 10 years. Snow melt is really rapid, really quick. Even in a moderately good snow year like this one, that we've just been having this winter, 2018-19, we've almost lost all the snow in the high country already, and here we're in the first week of May. And even in a what I like to say is a fairly good snow year, we lose it so quickly in the spring now. So that's kind of an introduction to. So consequently, obviously, that's had all sorts of dramatic effects on vegetation and wildlife that I've witnessed even in 20 odd years. My specialty was in birds. I now see species of birds that are chaparral species that typically that are common here at sort of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet. I now, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, have now started recording those at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. Those kinds of species are just able to move up slope because the vegetation's changing, the insect abundance of different species at different elevations is changing, and obviously because the snow that would have been there into April, May, June at those elevations, it's not there anymore. So those kind of species that are typically in warmer, drier environments lower down are now able to populate much higher up into the high country. That's been really striking. We've obviously vegetation moisture levels last year it was historically low. Obviously, I'm connected with through the fire lookouts with what Forest Service does. So I kind of hear those reports, and our vegetation moisture levels were historically low last year. We get fires are a typical part of chaparral, Southern California chaparral ecology. But obviously the size and the extent and the ferocity of them is unprecedented. We had one in July last year that called the Cranston Fire, which it didn't get the publicity of the big fires further north, understandably, because we didn't lose the same amount of property. We fortunately didn't suffer any of the terrible fatalities that they had further north, but it was 14,000 acres, and it just brushed the edge of Idlewild. We lost, I think it was 4 homes. We lost 2 of our 3 roads for a while. So yeah, those obviously environmental factors, something I'm particularly aware of given my background, but also just by virtue of the amount of time I spend up on the mountain. So I don't know if that answers that question, but yeah, I mean that in itself is something that you could talk about for hours on end.
Have you actually taken
mushrooms?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious if you see varieties of mushrooms there.
I have to say that's not an area of expertise. I mean, I do. I couldn't really tell you if there'd been dramatic changes in those. I don't that's just not something I'm super sensitive to in the same way that I would be with birds, butterflies, wildflowers, other mammals. So yeah, that's probably not something that I could really talk to with any expertise, I'm afraid.
Claudia, do you have a question?
Yes, I was talking on mute again. I was curious as to how do you see the animal population? How is it faring? Do you see a reduction in numbers, that sort of thing?
Let's think. There's more than one answer to that question depending on what we're talking about. So in the case of, there are some relatively well studied. I guess the simple answer is, unfortunately, there probably aren't enough data specifically for the San Jacintos to answer that for a lot of species. But with some species, they're particularly well studied. Mountain yellow-legged frog is one of the endangered species that's a particular focus up here. That has declined precipitously. That's true of obviously a lot of amphibian populations around the world. They're probably the most threatened group of animal on the planet right now, not just here, but obviously all over the place. I was talking actually this past summer with a biologist who worked up here back in the 70s and 80s, described creeks that actually, my house is right near one of those creeks where they used to be abundant. He was talking in terms of thousands or tens of thousands. He just walks along any of the creeks, and they were extremely common. Now we went out and we found, we're talking handfuls, literally single digits, maybe 10, 15, 20 individuals, those kinds of numbers. And that's not, I'm not talking about something that's happened over a century or a half century. We're talking about something that's happened in at most sort of 30, 40 years, probably less. And that, that's caused by various factors. There's been an awful lot, the huge increase in recreation has caused a lot of impacts on some of the creeks. There's just changes in the vegetation structure around them. But obviously the biggest single factor has been just the change in water flows within the creeks. A lot of creeks that I look at the topo maps and they show them as perennial springs or perennial creeks. They're just not perennial anymore. We've had one of the nice things with this winter, hiking around this spring, is that some water bodies that I haven't seen flow for the last 6 years are trickling, have been flowing with some snowmelt and with some of the rainwater we've had. So whether that is sufficient to have any kind of long-term impact on something like amphibian populations, it's probably not going to matter, because I also think a winter like this is kind of the exception rather than the rule at this point. So that's one particular species that's been well studied. I'd say rather than necessarily the problem is at higher elevation is a lot of animal populations fluctuate wildly from year to year anyway. So for example, a couple of years ago we had a failure of the crop, the pine cone, the pine seed crop in limber and lodgepole pines, which are the two species that we have primarily at high elevation. And as a consequence, that kind of pretty much wiped out the populations of several bird species that typically occur at high elevation. But that's not necessarily something to do with a long-term change, like a climate effect. That's kind of typical at high elevation, that you have these fairly wild swings back and forth. So there's a lot of noise in there in terms of long-term changes versus short-term changes, and that's something that's a challenge in the mountains.